Welcome to today's demo of integration of SQL Server 2012 with Zementis ADAPA server using SSIS. I think first, to get started, we need to take a look at what our ecosystem is going to look like and what we're going to show today. The first part is that we have a model that has already been predetermined. Normally that would take some time to get set up, and we have it deployed inside of Zementis. The next part of that is we're going to go ahead and we're going to update or insert a new record inside of our SQL Server. We're going to have a trigger that's going to get that new data and pass it over to SSIS. We're going to use our SSIS control and data flows to connect to ADAPA's web services. And from there, we're going to score and execute our model, which is going to score our particular entries. And we're going to take our new predictions that come back from the score and send them by web service format back over to SSIS and update those predictions back into SQL Server. So to get started, let's take a look at an actual execution. In this case, we have a data table, iris data, that we're going to be inserting a new record into. The iris model takes 4 columns: sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width. And we're going to pass in some values that are appropriate. We have a trace table where we're going to be storing the data that our trigger is going to collect temporarily. And we're going to have a score table where our results back from ADAPA are going to end up. Need to make sure that our SQL agent here is running. And we're going to go ahead and execute our query. So we've got one row that was put in. We can take a look and we can see that in our particular execution, we have our record. That's our data 5.3 and our 5.4 for petal. In this particular table, we have a timestamp, which is kind of a little bit more normal to put in on trace tables like this, as well as an instance key, which we'll talk about as we get into the SSIS part. The trace table is there in order to offset our triggers, so they're fast performing, and they're picked up by our particular SQL agent, and then the results of the score themselves are placed back into our score table. And we can see that our results have already returned back, and here's our particular value. So let's go ahead and see what are the different parts that are necessary to get that running. The first thing is that you need to be a domain user logged in. Your box has to be attached to a domain. This is due to Microsoft's security, and that's going to be very important. The next thing we need to make sure is that that we have SQL Server integration services actually running and installed. So we can see here that we've got our SQL Server integration services installed, and we can see that they're running. A very important part that is you'll need to probably make a change on is that the SQL agent is running as a domain user, as well as the integration services need to be started as a domain user. The local system or NT service will not be sufficient security rights in order for it to execute. So once we've got those parts set up, while we're doing any kind of debugging, we're also going to want to run our management studio as administrator so that we have access to modify higher level SSIS packages and whatnot. Once that we've got everything running and executing, the next part that we're going to want to take a look at is creating our trace table. So our trace table here is pretty straightforward. It's got an identity ID column that's automatically inserted. That's just to make sure that each record is uniquely identified. A timestamp, which is inserted automatically as well. And that just kind of helps us to figure out when actions occurred. These are our columns that we're inserting that come off of our particular table, and an instance key, which is a date time value. The next part is looking our score table. Our score table is set up relative to the results of our PMML. We have an identity column again, And then our model returns 4 columns right now: class, and our 3 different probabilities that are used inside of our score. We used and talked about a trigger in order to collect the information and execute it. And so inside of our trigger, it's fairly straightforward. As you can see, we're doing an altering of a trigger on insert, and we're inserting into our iris data trace table that we've created the 4 column values that we also pull off of our inserted column. And inserted is a keyword that SQL Server recognizes and uses. And that'll be that instance record that was triggered or forced the trigger to occur, and it will select it and insert it into the record. So after that, we should take a look at setting up our SQL SSIS package. So we're going to open up our Studio tool. And inside of Studio, you would be creating a new project if you're starting from scratch. We're going to be creating an integration services out of business intelligence and integrated service project. By default, if you install SQL Server 2012 with the SSIS package, these tools are installed by default. Inside of our tool, we're going to be creating a new flow. And inside of our flow, we're going to actually upload and add an existing package. In our case, we're going to be add existing package. We're going to use our file system, and we're going to navigate to wherever that particular file is. And our ADAPA multiple file that we've loaded up here, as you can see, has in the control flow, has 3 steps to it. The first is assigning the instance key. The instance key is used as our SSIS packages can take some time to execute depending on how long and how complicated a model is. So since we may have some duration of time, or if we're triggering these very quickly, the instance key is used in order to ensure that the rows are only selected and used by one running instance of SSIS, as compared to if we didn't have this, the data might be picked up by multiple and our scores could be erroneous. And our first things for setting up, we're going to want to change and set up our connection string to wherever your database is. And if we've changed the name of our trace table from irisdata_trace, you're also going to want to update that. In this case, we're setting our values that we're putting into our instance table to the system start time. This would already be set up in the package, but this represents the start time of this instance of SSIS that's running this, that's been triggered and kicked off. While we're here, we also will want to set up our connection string and select the one that we've done and set up in our first value. Again, changing our name here on the deleting part. And in this column here, our steps are running in sequential order, as you can see by the arrow. The last step that we execute is to remove those rows that have actually been processed already. And we're using our instance key, which is again our start value, as the key in order to select those. Process through ADAPA goes into our data flow, and inside of our data flow, we're using an only DB source, which is the incoming data, and we're using the result of this, we're going to be putting into our score table using an only DB destination, which is we're putting something back into the database. And the first step we're going to do is make sure our connection string is using the right database. And we're going to select the trace table, the table that we created as the temporary holding of where our data was being inserted from our trigger. We're going to want to make sure to select all the columns that are applicable. In this case, it's very important to have the instance key plus our data ones to be selected. The next is we're going to do a route system. And in this case, we're going to select the rows that are important for us. The condition that we're going to look at here is making sure that our instance key is not null. So when we inserted our data, we had a null value. And in our first stage of our control flow, we assigned our instance key. We updated the value. So any rows that are null at this point are ones that are from a different or new data that's come in that we don't want to look at. The other part is we also want to select only those instance keys that are equal to our current start running time. So this allows us to have multiple SSIS packages running simultaneously if we need to. And only the data that runs for this instance will be selected. Those rows will be now passed on to the script control. And on the input columns, we can see that the 4 columns that we selected originally out of our trace table are there and applicable in value. We can also have and set our output columns. Our output columns, you can see we can name them anything, and we can set the precision to match that is coming back from the model or what's in the database itself. And these represent the columns that are inside of our score table. So we have our PMML model will return these 3 predictions as well as the class. And we can set different values from strings, doubles, floats, etc. We're going to want to make sure that our connection manager is also set up. And as we go into our script, this is a script control. The first thing that we're going to want to do is ensure that we've set ourselves up with a service reference. So when we create a new instance here, this would be mostly a skeleton empty code. We're going to add a new service reference. And our service reference will point to our instance of the ADAPA server that's running. The next part of this is on our setup, our pre-execution. And in our pre-execution, we want to select the model that we're executing against. We could do this at runtime if needed. In this case, we're selecting a particular instance of the model. The next part is that we want to set up our security. And ADAPA supports different levels of security. In this case, we're using basic security. It is running localhost, so we don't have to worry about SSL or certificate sharing, which is also supported by .NET. And the endpoint itself, this is our core endpoint. You can see that we are going localhost here, and we are using the web services and the WSDL command to do that, and we're setting up our username and password. At the end of everything, we're going to want to clean up our resources. We're going to want to close our client down that we've created and make it nullable so that .NET cleans up any kind of resources and sharing that's occurred. The meat of our processing is inside of our process input, and this function would be created by default when you edit the script. ADAPA services supports executing multiple rows at the same time, each one getting its own unique score value. Now, of course, this depends on how your model is set up. By default, any data that's passed in as a transaction would have its own score. Sometimes you can set up your models to process all the data at the same time. In this case, we're going to make sure that we're setting up each one of our records. We're going to create a record, and we're going to process and set up the data the way that our web service call requires it. So record type and field type are 2 objects that are actually passed in by our service reference instance, and it comes from our web service WSDL call. These are objects that you can now add fields to, and each one of them has a name and a value. And those are the names of the field, petal length, for example, or petal width. And we're going to pass in the values that are coming on the row. So 5.3 and 5.4 were the values that we passed in originally. And once we've got a field created, we're going to want to have all of those fields put together and add them as a record. And then we're going to add that record to a record list. So we end up with, at the end of all of that, we're going to end up with an array of records if we have multiple entries inside of our service. We're showing a SQL agent that's running every minute in this particular demo. Obviously, you might be running different windows of time, might be 30 minutes or an hour. And during those time periods, obviously, a lot of records may accumulate. And so in this case, we might have multiple records accumulated inside of this, and we can execute them all within one SSIS execution system. Next, we're going to be setting up the data for our headers and our web service call, this is a little bit more of .NET needs. And we're actually going to go ahead and apply. The client apply is the actual web service call. We're going to pass in the model that we want to execute with our records. And then we're going to get our outputs. And our outputs, each one of the record or the columns, each row in the output represents one of the scores for each one of the records that were sent in. And we want to map each one of our columns, our classes, and our other predicted areas to the output columns that we originally set up. And by setting the value, field.value, to each one of our output columns, we've now mapped our data on what returns out of our script object. And as we go into our OLE destination, we are going to make sure that our database connection is set up. And we're going to choose our score table. Now we have our predictions. We want to put them back in the database. We can do neat things by keeping identities or locking the table. We're going to want to look at our mappings here. And in our mappings, we can see that the input columns for this particular entry inside of SSIS, these are the outputs from our script control, and we want to map those to each one of the columns in the database properly. And that's it. Once we return back to the control flow out of our process of ADAPA, the last step was to remove rows processed, and we covered that at the beginning, where we actually remove the rows back out of our database. We need to make sure that our SQL server or our ADAPA server is running. In this case, we're running at localhost here. We could be running that on the cloud or on another server instance somewhere else. We want to make sure that it's also available and running. And you can see here that these are all models that are executing, and we have our iris model that's available. The last step is setting up our SQL agent. In our SQL Server agent, we're going to want to create a new job. We're going to want to set up, with our new job, we're going to set up the owner of the job to be a user that has high enough credentials in order to execute the job and have access to the tables. We're only going to have one step to it, and that is running SSIS. Now we do show here that we're executing the SQL agent as one path. We can also execute SSIS inline inside of our trigger. And it depends on overall how fast your SSIS packages execute, and in our case, how long and how fast our models execute on the other side. Generally, when a trigger, you want triggers to be generally fast and quick so that they can return back to wherever the insert is coming from. The trigger executing on a long period of time, such as executing inline to an SSIS package, may actually hold up locks on your database until that SSIS package completes its execution. So you can do that under one case. We generally show the opposite side of that. We do support both, of course. Once you set up your name for your package, you're going to want to select the type inside of our agent to be the SQL Server Integration Services package. You're going to want to use the SQL Service Agent Service Count. That's why our account needs to be running as a domain user, because of the security model that's required to execute SSIS systems. We're going to want to select the SSIS package store, and the user that we're selecting here at this time in order to select the package, we're going to use our Windows authentication because it has a high enough security because we're logged in as a domain user. Inside of our package, we're going to go to File System and find the particular package that we're interested in. Press OK, and then move on back to our next step. The next step is the schedule. In our demo, we're showing executing every minute. Obviously, we probably wouldn't run in production every minute. Choose the window appropriate. There are a lot of options for setup, reoccurring, and go through it and choose the appropriate set of schedule that makes sense for your instance. At the end of it, once we create it, we're going to want to make sure that it's enabled, and everything else should flow. So what we've done so far is we had our table. We created a trigger on our table in order to insert data into our trace table on insert. We created our trace table with columns that were appropriate for storing our data. We created a score table that has the results of our particular model execution. We've created a SQL agent that will fire off when appropriate on a scheduled time period to call SSIS and execute the SSIS package that we've selected. That package The first step is to update the values and make sure that we're only talking and selecting the data that we should select as our instance keys. We go through and select all of the records that are appropriate for this instance running. Call over our web service call over to ADAPA server, take our results and put them back into our score table, and then remove our rows processed at the end in order to make sure that we have a cleanup of our overall system. When we execute again, just doing another example here, if we were to run through some additional values through, we've inserted a record. Our table now will have still only one record. We have our timestamp but no instance key. And as we wait for the SQL agent to execute, you can also take a look and notice that our score table will have only 2 records in it. We can see that those 2 records are records already been removed from here because our score table has the new record that has been scored from our original call. This ends our presentation for integrating ADAPA with SQL Server 2012. It does work with 2008 as well as 2008 R2 using SSIS as the go-between for our systems. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.